What would a fight between Ukraine and Russia look like?
Well, I think, first of all, the Ukrainian armed forces of today are not the Ukrainian armed forces of 2014. But the land forces have real capability.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Back Story. I'm Dana Lewis. Russian forces are massing on Ukraine's border. As we speak, NATO is on high alert. U.S. President Biden has reassured the Ukrainian president the U.S. will support Ukraine. The EU has also issued warnings to Russia not to attack. But since 2014, Russia has annexed illegally the Crimea from Ukraine. It has seized Ukrainian Navy ships. It has armed and funded so-called Russian-backed rebels in eastern Ukraine, with some 14,000 people killed in 7 years. A low-level war on a low simmer has been ratcheted up in recent weeks. Russia denies it is directly involved, calling it an internal conflict. The West saying the evidence of Russian involvement is so crystal clear it's hardly worth the Kremlin's ridiculous denial. On this backstory, why is this war about to escalate? What's Putin after? Why now? And what could happen? All right, Ben Hodges joins us now from Frankfurt, Germany, where he is the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Hi, Ben.
Hey, Dana. Thanks for having me on.
And you have decades of military experience as a former U.S. Lieutenant General, retired, who also served as the commanding general of the United States Army in Europe. So you know very well what preparations NATO would take in the Baltics and against any kind of Russian threat.
Well, sure. Especially the last 6 or 7 years, we've refocused and re-energized. That's we, the U.S., but also we, NATO. Deterrence efforts, exercises, improving intelligence sharing, those kinds of things.
Right. So how do you, first of all, how do you size up this threat of Russian forces on the Ukrainian border? I mean, there's a sizable buildup there. It looks like the Ukraine's army general, Ruslan Komchak, has said that there are 28 battalion tactical groups on the eastern border and in the Crimea, and that's around 25,000 troops.
Three things. First of all, this for sure is a test of the Biden administration. President Biden, I was happy when he had his first phone call with President Putin, and he tells President Putin, Ukrainian sovereignty is a priority for the United States. I mean, that's a policy statement. We don't have a strategy for the Black Sea region yet, but that was an important policy statement. So I'm sure that President Putin is testing out, okay, how high a priority is it actually? What are you really going to do? Secondly, what's happening in Ukraine on the border with these tactical groups you're talking about, of course, is not in isolation. Within the same week, we had 10 different intercepts by NATO aircraft from the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, down to the Black Sea. And reports are that these intercepts were a little bit more sophisticated and longer duration than the normal kind of airspace violations or the kind of reactions. And then, of course, at the same time, you had these three Russian submarines all came up together through the ice up in the Arctic on an impressive demonstration of capability. And, you know, this was not a coincidence that all these things happened at the same time. The third thing to keep in mind, of course, is that not only are Russian troops on the border, but they still illegally occupy Crimea, and they've increased. Everybody saw the video of self-propelled howitzers crossing that big bridge across the Kerch Strait into Crimea, and they still are killing Ukrainian soldiers in the Donbass. So I think this is all an attempt to put pressure on the Biden administration, to put pressure on President Zelensky, and perhaps it's preparation for a large exercise, or it's preparation for something else.
Let's talk about something else.
So the problem is that the Russians refuse to be transparent. they call big snap exercises that clearly should, in accordance with Vienna documents, require them to notify everybody and to invite observers. They never do that. They're or not in a meaningful way, and they intentionally do this without any transparency. And this is where Germany and France should really be cranking up the pressure on the Kremlin, hold them accountable, but they never do, unfortunately. The something else, though, could be the beginning of additional military operations in Donbass. I don't think that's likely. What I do think is a possibility is a movement to seize this canal that brings water from it used to bring water from the Dnipro River down into Crimea. As soon as Russia seized Crimea, Ukraine blocked that canal, turned off the water flow, and so there is a water shortage in Crimea. The Russians are using this as a pretext, calling it a humanitarian crisis, and we may have to do something about it. And that would not be a surprise if they were to do that. So perhaps all this other stuff is a distraction as they make preparations to seize this canal, which really is not about water. It's more about increasing their hold on southern parts of Ukraine. And I think Odessa is the ultimate objective, to completely isolate Ukraine from the Black Sea.
Can we talk about NATO for a minute? NATO goes on a high state of alert. Why? Ukraine is not a NATO country.
Well, it was EUCOM, U.S. European Command, that raised the watch level, which got my attention. Now, what does that mean? Of course, raising the watch level means more assets are paying attention to what Russian forces are doing in the region. It moved Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken, and the president all to continue to assure the Ukrainians, we're with you. President Biden had his call with President Zelensky finally. I think that that's noteworthy. And the fact that Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, of course, reached out to his Ukrainian counterpart and to his Russian counterpart.
But what would the U.S. European Command, under orders from President Biden to support Ukraine, do? I mean, they would not move forces into Ukraine, would they? Although they're doing some training there.
So it's a great question. You're right. Ukraine is not a NATO ally, so there's not a Article 5 type situation. And I'm personally interested to see what does this higher priority mean? I think 4 or 5 things could happen and should happen. Designate Ukraine as a major non-NATO ally, for example, which would free up more opportunities for training, for information exchange, for providing equipment, things like it makes it easier to do that sort of thing. And it elevates Ukraine to a different sort of level. That would be one thing. The second thing would be an affirmation that the United States will continue to support the training mission, what's called JMTGU, Joint Multinational Training Group Ukraine, out in the Yavoriv Training Center in Western Ukraine. We will continue doing that. An offer to expand training infrastructure at other Ukrainian training bases. So there may or may not be a show of force or something like that, but I don't think those would be particularly useful, because Russia knows that just because you had a B-1 or a B-2 bomber or something fly by or whatever, so what? What would be more significant is increases in military aid and exercises, something like that. But I think long term, declare, for example, in addition to the Sea Breeze exercise we do with Ukraine every year in the Black Sea, we're going to connect the Saber Guardian exercise we do in Romania and the Noble Partner exercise we do with Georgia with Sea Breeze, and have a large Zapad-like exercise every year that's joint multinational to demonstrate that this area matters to us. The real weapon, though, or leverage, is financial. And this is where I think the previous administrations have stopped short of shutting down major parts of Russian banking systems. We've done sanctions, but we haven't inflicted severe pain on the oligarchs. And I think I would imagine that they would be considering something like that, so that if the Kremlin did something more severe, that would be a lever, and even the Germans would have to act on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's been talk of suspending SWIFT payments, and I mean, you can basically freeze banking in Russia. But
Exactly.
Look, in terms of, the Trump administration was under criticism for withholding funds for supporting Ukrainians' military. And then I think at some point, they were released in the end. And so is the West only giving money, or we're in there selling arms and supplying arms already, are we not?
Yeah, sure. The total amount each year is somewhere between $400 and $500 million. So we have provided equipment, night vision devices, counterfire radar, and of course, under President Trump, the decision was made to provide javelins. So what's referred to as lethal aid, actual weapons.
Those are anti-tank weapons.
Best anti-tank weapon in the world that a soldier carries, and very effective. Now, these are not deployed along the front line. I don't know what the exact rules are for control, but they are kept consolidated back somewhere by Ukrainian forces. The counterfire radar has always been a very useful, popular bit of aid, because it can not only provide early warning of incoming rockets or artillery, which is obviously useful, but it also helps tell where they came from, and so which is useful for counterfire. The medical care or equipment, secure communications, those kind of things, that's been the norm of what we've provided. You remember, Ukraine used to be the weapons manufacturer for the Soviet Union. I mean, that's where a lot of the stuff was actually manufactured.
BMPs, so, the APCs, right. Even nuclear weapons at one point.
The Russian Navy today cannot manufacture what they need for ships, because it used to be manufactured in Ukraine. Certain propulsion systems, for example, helicopter components. Very interesting. And so it's not like Ukraine doesn't know how to do stuff. The birthplace of the legendary T-34 tank is in Kharkiv in Ukraine. I visited that factory. They're still making tanks. That was really cool.
Does President Putin of Russia have a legitimate beef here? He complains about constant NATO expansion. Ukraine has expressed interest in becoming a member of NATO. Russia sees NATO as a threat into its sphere of influence. Are we pushing Russia into a corner?
Absolutely not. He has no legitimate leg to stand on. First of all, people should ask, well, why is it that every country that was ever under the Tsar or the Soviet Union or in the Warsaw Pact went scrambling to join NATO at the first possible opportunity? What is it about their history that tells them we want to be in NATO and we want to be in the European Union? What is that? And nobody's knocking on the door of the Kremlin saying, hey, please let me back in, change my mind. Nobody, not even the Russians that live in Estonia and Latvia, want to go home, if you will. For sure, the Russians have always felt like they had to have to protect their frontier. The problem is, in the 21st century, you can't use force. Well, you can, but you shouldn't use force to change boundaries and to decide what other countries are going to do. And that's what they have done. They've occupied 20% of Georgia. They've occupied part of Ukraine. They have troops sitting in Transnistria. All of these things, and now they're back into Belarus. This is all to make sure that none of those countries is able to join the EU or NATO. That's their objective, to keep that sort of non-NATO, non-EU presence on their borders. And of course, they don't want their own citizens who have suffered under decades of Russian or Soviet leadership to see how much better life is when you have those kind of freedoms.
All of this started in 2014 when President Yanukovych, President Putin campaigned openly for Yanukovych at one point. There has always been a tug of war in Ukraine with Russia over influence there. And when the Maidan revolution happened in 2014, Yanukovych was forced to flee. He is in Russia now, I think, as we speak. Russia turns it back, though, and it says it was Ukrainian aggression in the east, and that this is a natural grassroots uprising by rebels in the east. They are trained by Russia. They are helped by Russia to some extent, but they say it's a domestic situation in Ukraine, and that they are merely peacekeepers there. What's your take on what is the reality?
So Russia is anything but a peacekeeper or innocent bystander when it comes to Donbass. That's a total fairy tale that they would like everybody to believe, and unfortunately, Berlin and Paris tend to kind of look the other way or sort of tolerate that. Yesterday, the German foreign minister, for example, called for both sides to de-escalate. Like, where both sides de-escalate? The Russians are the ones that are inside Ukraine. So that feeds the Russian narrative. And of course, Russia is putting out the civil war that's happening in Ukraine. It may spread towards the border, so we may have to do something. Again, total BS, fairy tale, but it's how they kind of try to set the conditions as a pretext to then go in and do something about it.
Which they did with Georgia. There was all of that media stuff with Georgia leading up to right. Russia pushing into Georgia.
And for sure, part of what's been going on is they're trying to provoke President Zelensky to direct that the Ukrainian forces do something to counter it. That would be, then the Russians say, look, we have to protect ourselves. We have to protect Russians, et cetera. Now, not even a brand new second lieutenant believes for a minute that what the Ukrainians are fighting against in the Donbass are just, rebels or militants or separatists. That is, again, this is more the total fairy tale. Just think about it. The amount of equipment and ammunition and what's been used, the capabilities that the so-called separatists have is not something you can put together in a barn or in your mother's basement. I mean, this is state-supported. And of course, because the Russians do not allow the OSCE to do their job, the border, the official border between Russia and Ukraine is absolutely wide open. And so is just convoys all the time. And there's so much imagery that's out there showing Russian equipment and troops all throughout the Donbass. So again, this is a part of the fairy tale. Their reason for being there, of course, is they want to have a destabilized Ukraine, and that the ultimate solution or negotiated solution of the Minsk process using the Normandy format is that Donetsk and Luhansk will still be part of Ukraine, but they will have basically veto power over any kind of international decisions that the Ukrainian government will take, i.e., NATO, EU, that kind of thing. Forget it. So that's the desired outcome for the Kremlin. Is that sort of leverage over what Ukraine does.
That was this talk of a federal system, but I didn't realize packed in there was a veto over relations with the West and the EU and NATO. Last question to you. What would a fight between Ukraine and Russia look like?
Well, I think, first of all, the Ukrainian armed forces of today are not the Ukrainian armed forces of 2014. They stopped Russian and Russian-led separatists are on this line of contact now. There's still fighting going on. More than 20 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed just in the last few months during a so-called ceasefire. But the Ukrainian armed forces have developed a large number of experienced, hardened combat leaders now. It's not perfect. The Ukrainian Air Force would be severely outmatched if it became force on force because of the air defense systems that the Russians have all over the place. Same thing in the Black Sea. The Ukrainian Navy had to start all over basically after Russia took over everything in Crimea. But the land forces have real capability. So it's the air and maritime components, which would be the most concerning.
Ben Hodges, thanks so much, Ben.
Thanks very much, Dan. Appreciate it.
All right, James Sherr is a military expert. He is the senior fellow at the Tallinn-based International Center for Defense and Security, who has advised Western governments on Russia's military capabilities. James, first of all, welcome, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
What do you make of this increase in Russian military activity on Ukraine's border? Are they going to attack?
First, understand the political context. From Russia's point of view, the Minsk Accords, which were 6 years ago now, were designed to insert enemies of the Ukrainian state into Ukraine's structures of power. The aim has never changed since Ukraine's independence. They recognized Ukraine's independence because they didn't think anything would come of it. And by 2014, they exhausted all the peaceful options, and that's why we are where we are, and these things happened. There has been no narrowing of the gap between the Russian position, which I mentioned, and the Ukrainian position, certainly not that, or even the French and German position, because they play a very prominent role in this whole so-called Minsk process. And the Russians have become exasperated. So what has happened since January is they have raised the temperature at many levels. In January, the foreign minister Lavrov gave what he described as an ultimatum to the Germans and the French, which is basically make Ukraine behave or we will make Ukraine behave. And accompanying that, there has been the steady increase in military activity on the demarcation line, and more recently, all these very, very ominous troop movements. So that's the first point. But the second point, as some of your listeners will know, is that the Russians are absolute masters in massing and moving forces in order to frighten people and get them to concede before a war starts. But when that doesn't happen, they also understand that an even better way of frightening people might be to use forces. And that's where we are. And they don't want us to know what their intentions are.
What do they consider to be Ukrainian? What do they consider to be Ukrainian aggression then? Is this the banning of Russian TV stations, the cutting of water to the Crimea? Well, is there something that's increased?
In the recent context, nothing has increased. The water situation in Crimea is greatly misunderstood. There's a water problem throughout southern Ukraine. The channel that supplies water to Crimea has stopped being functional a long time ago. They're inventing pretexts. They're constantly, the media is amplifying all sorts of Ukrainian attacks on the demarcation line that simply haven't taken place. The Ukrainians are being, even when they're coming under increased attack, they're responding to the minimal degree necessary. The Russians are trying to put pressure on them so that they respond in a way which gives them a convincing pretext to say enough is enough. And then the military option comes in. And there are some military options. They all talk about this in the background, all the Russian retired generals, some of the serving officers, political people, experts. There are some military options they present that are not only very lurid, meaning, driving to the Dnieper River, throwing the Ukrainians completely out of the Sea of Azov, seizing Mariupol, all of that stuff, which I don't think are terribly realistic. And they don't fit the observable data, at least I have access to, about their massing and deployment of troops. But there are possibilities of more localized, but still devastating escalation that would change the game, dramatically change the game militarily, but also politically.
What would that be? What kind of land grab? I assume that's what it is. What would that be?
Well, it might not be a land grab. You see, up to now, the Ukrainians on the Minsk demarcation line have been opposite so-called national militia of the unrecognized republics. And they're a very motley force. Of course, they're all commanded by Russian officers and their specialist Russian units there. But the Ukrainians can deal with that. Quite another thing if, as many have been suggesting for a long time in Russia, the Russians deploy so-called peacekeepers, general purpose forces, right up to that demarcation line, and then put pressure on the Ukrainians, because then the Ukrainians would be retaliating against dedicated Russian troops whose presence is not being disguised, but being advertised to the world. So it really boxes them in, and from that position, they can dial up the pressure whenever they want and go further if they want.
And to what end? Just to continue to destabilize Ukraine so that NATO doesn't go into Ukraine?
No, it's not NATO, because Yanukovych, the last president who fled the country, gave them everything they wanted when it came to NATO, and then all their focus and all their venom shifted to Ukraine's relationship with the EU. And they forced him into effectively abandoning all of his plans for that. And that's why you had the second Maidan, the so-called Revolution of Dignity, and he fled the country. So this is old stuff. I mean, just to underscore, none of what's going on is about the unrecognized republics. These so-called republics represent 4% of Ukraine's territory. It's never been about them. It's been about Ukrainian statehood. And the Russians want to define what Ukrainian statehood means and what it does not. And this has been the fundamental issue. The problem has been compounded, in my view, by the fact that Ukraine's so-called Normandy partners, Germany and France, still seem to operate under the assumption that you could find some kind of magic formula for compromise which will settle this down and eventually end this conflict. It's not in the cards. The Russians make it clear it's not in the cards. They're very explicit as to what they want. And everyone thinks they can be persuaded to want something else. Well, I don't think that is possible unless the West raises its game and changes its game. And then, of course, you have, and this is a factor in the mobilization, you have the Biden administration. Now, the Russians hear all the tough rhetoric and they see all the tough body language. But the question for them is, well, where's the substance? What are they actually in a position to do? And they would like to test them and expose all this rhetoric as hollow, particularly now, before the administration is properly bedded down, when it's visibly preoccupied with China and Taiwan. And, so there's an argument taking place about how far can you test the Biden administration without getting into extremely risky territory. And that's another reason why my suspicion is if there's going to be military action, they are unlikely to go beyond the established demarcation line, because they'll say, we're just enforcing Minsk. We're not changing the territorial realities.
You think an escalation is inevitable?
No, absolutely not. As I said, they're trying to frighten people into conceding. But I am saying it's very possible. And, it's very possible. It could happen tomorrow afternoon. It could happen in several weeks. It could happen over the summer. But it will be based on a political military calculation that the Kremlin takes about the relative dangers of action in military terms and inaction.
I would think if they take some military action, even if it's minimal, if you can refer to military action as minimal, but if they don't go very far, towards Donetsk and Lugansk, then that may backfire, won't it? Because the West support and the U.S. support specifically, not only NATO, but U.S. support, will only increase to Ukraine after that.
Well, they occupied Donetsk anyway. It's part of the established setup. No, I don't think so, because this has never happened yet. It's never happened yet. The response to everything they've done, yes, been a mixture of sanctions, so there's some pressure, and diplomacy, compromise. And they don't see Europe as capable of really doing more than that. They don't take the EU seriously as a foreign policy actor, and certainly not as a military actor. So part of the question is, and this might have been said to Zelensky, is Biden putting clear blue water between what the Europeans are doing and the so-called Minsk process that the US is not part of, and US policy, which is independent, much tougher, and of course, much more critical. So is the Biden administration, A, prepared to say, we will not stand idly by and watch Ukraine's statehood destroyed? And secondly, is there any, if they say that, is there anything they can do in practical terms that would be consistent with that? I don't fully know the answer, and the Russians don't. But as I said, I could see them wanting to test it, and it would be better to test it now than much later when the whole administration is fleshed out with all its people, when they have put together a proper concerted strategy for dealing with this problem. All of these things, they're beginning now at very, very high speed with a smaller cast than they would like. But, all this is to be discovered. We don't know the answer to these questions yet.
James Sherr, thank you so much for being generous with your time. It's great to talk to you.
It's been a pleasure, Dana. Thanks a lot.
All right, Paul Niland helped set up Lifeline Ukraine, which is the country's first national 24/7 suicide prevention and mental health support services. And he joins me from Kiev, I believe.
Yes, I'm in Kiev. That's correct. Yeah.
Hi, Paul. What is the human toll of this war that 20 soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, have been killed so far this year, but this has gone on year by year by year since 2014.
Yeah, the war started in the Donbass in the spring of 2014, exactly. Initially, ground zero, in fact, was a city called Slovyansk, not a place that had been known for any kind of intense pro-Russian sentiment, but that was where it started. That was the outbreak of hostilities, and then once the Ukrainian army got into swing and went out to the east and started driving people back, the Russians. So there's a guy. The initial commander was a guy called Igor Gerkin, and he pulled his forces back from Slovyansk and made Donetsk, the main city of Donetsk, their main base. Prior to that, with Slovyansk being further out, Donetsk was like a given, and it was supposed to be protected by the further outposts of population centers that had been taken over. But Slovyansk itself it's a very interesting example to talk about the outbreak of the war, because after liberation, Slovyansk returned to being a peaceful part of government-controlled Ukraine, and there's not a wide number of residents of Slovyansk that are clamoring to be brought back.
That's important, right? Because Russia says that these are grassroots rebellions, and that would indicate something different.
The reality is the exact opposite. It's not grassroots at all. I have many friends who have left the Donbass because of the war there, and they tell me, I hear it from them firsthand, that they had no inkling that there was any kind of war that was brewing on their home territory. And the reality that we know now is that Russia pulls all of the strings. The entire command and control hierarchy of the military forces, it's all Russia. All of the equipment comes from Russia. All of the ammunition comes from Russia. The fuel for the tanks, everything is Russian. Many of the fighters, not all of them, but many of them, but even those, let's say, Ukrainian people who have signed up to the military forces fighting against Ukraine, they're under that Russian command and control structure. They are operating.
If Russia was not there, would the separatist movement evaporate tomorrow?
Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. And in fact, a friend of mine is the last properly elected mayor of Donetsk. My friend that I'm talking about, I mean, a guy I know well. He was at my wedding, and he's a businessman from Donetsk, and so he was telling me the mayor was his schoolmate when they went to school together, and that mayor actually sat down together with Gierkin and another guy called Besler, and he said to them, "What do you need to get out?" And he kind of made the sign for handing over cash. "What do you need to leave us alone?" And they pointed to Moscow and they said one word: prikaz, orders from Moscow. Yeah, the entire thing is manufactured and created by Russia, and we know this as well. There's something called the Surkov tapes, and so one of Vladimir Putin's top advisors, a guy called Vladislav Surkov, his emails were linked, and there's tapes of his conversations. He's the curator of the Kremlin's war against Ukraine.
Russia is there, and they use the East as a pressure point because after their man in Kiev, Yanukovych, fled, the Maidan revolution in 2014, Russia didn't want to let go of Ukraine. So what do you think they want in Ukraine? To just control the near or far, their sphere of influence? Is this about money? Is this about fear of a threat from NATO? If you had to pick one of them, which would it be?
It's not a fear of a threat from NATO. It's a fear of the threat that something like Maidan would be repeated in Russia. That's Vladimir Putin's, greatest fear. We all know that. And the revolution actually, excuse me, the revolution wasn't 2014. It was 2013 and 2014. It started on the 21st of November, finished when Yanukovych fled on the 22nd of February. And I use the dates because it's important to describe then what happened after that. So the military operation to grab Crimea began on the 27th of February. So it was 5 days after Yanukovych fled, just 5 days. And, in that period, obviously, there's no demonstrable threat to the people of Crimea. Putin didn't have to act to protect anybody, which sort of is the pretext that he's trying to line up now for a new move against Ukraine in the Donbass. But one of the reasons is because Putin needed to change the narrative very, very quickly. And Putin saw as well at the same, when I say change the narrative, Russian media for the 93 days of our revolution had been obsessed with what was going on the Maidan, right? And when we, the protesters, I was one of them, when we were successful, when Yanukovych fled, a new propaganda narrative was needed, and it was the seizure of Crimea. And primarily, I would say, yes, changing the narrative was important, but it's really all about Russia's military base. And from the more militarized Crimea, Russia has maintained various military operations.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we understand why that's important to the Black Sea and why that might be important to the Russian Navy, but I don't understand strategically what they're getting out of the East other than keeping Ukraine unbalanced.
It does that. It keeps Ukraine unbalanced, yeah. But again, like if we talk about the narratives that come out, it's like keeping plates spinning, right? When you see someone doing that trick and they've got all of their sticks and the plates, and once the jubilation over the theft of Crimea had started to wane a little, Russia needed something else to talk about. And the other thing that they needed as well was leverage. So the international community obviously rejected Russia's claims of, Crimea is now part of Russia, full stop, get over it. And so in part, the conflict in Donbass was created as a leverage, as a tool in negotiations. And we've seen it being discussed quite openly. What they say is, okay, if you forget the Donbass question, you forget the Crimea question, then we'll use our influence direction, really, over the people in Donbass, and Ukraine can return to being a peaceful place. That's what they've attempted to try to negotiate several times. So they create their own problem to give themselves a bargaining chip.
What is the feeling in Ukraine right now as you see, a number of sort of brigade-sized forces on the border? I mean, up to, an additional 4,000, but probably some 25,000 Russian forces, pushing into the Crimea area and then along the eastern border.
The feeling is really one of fear, because we know that military action is something that is quite likely. I see in this kind of situation. I was looking earlier on. There was a defense analyst from Finland who had looked at the kind or the nature of the tanks that we're seeing being moved towards Ukraine's border. And on the front of them, they have mine clearing equipment. On the back of them, they have long range fuel tanks, for example. So, that to me says that the preparations that are going on certainly are about potentially attempting to seize more territory. And when I say fear, we obviously we don't want that to happen. We don't want to have our soldiers face a more intense war again. And, the war's never stopped. You mentioned earlier on 20 Ukrainian military have died in the last month, but the war's never stopped. It simmered down in the summer of 2014 after Ukraine's forces had successfully liberated lots of towns and cities. The front line got established in one particular place, and it hasn't really moved much since then. But the most common form of killing on the front line actually comes from snipers from the Russian side. That's a tactic that they've employed more and more of over the last few years. But if it goes back to full scale war with multiple rocket launch systems and tanks and all these kind of heavy
and Russia would control the airspace as well.
That's a really actually interesting question about air superiority. And in the early days of the war, Ukraine's air force was actually quite active. What that would look like going forward, we've seen their military attack helicopters hovering around the borders of Ukraine over recent days. So that they're obviously looking at places where they can probe. But another thing actually to talk about and talk about how it is most certainly Russia's direct involvement in this war. The way, in fact, that they softened up the border is something that has been documented by Bellingcat. We all know who they are now, but I was following them back in the very, very early days. And one of Bellingcat's earliest
just so if people don't know what that is, Bellingcat is an investigative website that has done remarkable work in Syria. They've done remarkable work even on the poisoning of Alexei Navalny in Russia, and they use things like geolocating and a lot of different technical and electronic evidence to do investigations that are very enlightening. But go ahead, sorry.
So exactly that then. So the geolocation, what they did was analyzed how in the spring of 2014, Russia shelled Ukrainian territory from Russia. And they did this through geolocating exhaust tracks and impact sites from satellite images, and proved that thousands and thousands of rockets were fired from Russian territory, from the Russian Federation into Ukraine, and that's how they first softened up the border to enable their bigger attack that came later.
The little green that paved the way for the little green men who later on Russia said we're all rebels, Ukrainian rebels. So, So I mean, is there any illusion there that Ukraine could stand up to Russia in a military fight?
Ukraine has actually done that. The Ukrainian armed forces fought the Russians back, and they fought them to a standstill, and they've held the line ever since. So, the Ukrainian army actually, because of their combat experience of the last 7 years, they're now one of the strongest military forces, certainly in Europe, and I would estimate anywhere in the world.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I will say as well, you know what? I mean, in my introduction, you mentioned Lifeline Ukraine.
I want to come back to that.
The organization I created, I get to work alongside some of these veterans now, right? Many of my colleagues, because we have a peer-to-peer support platform, many of my colleagues are veterans, and I get to come and be with these guys every day. It's like the biggest privilege for me, really.
So let's go back to the very first question, which is the human toll of this, because I mean, I was in Maidan as well. I was there for the Orange Revolution before that, and then I came to the Maidan at the end of it, and talked to a lot of those young guys that were on the, I don't know if you call them barricades, or, I mean, it was a mess there where they were taking shelter behind anything they could, and had built, anything out of tires or anything to evade the security forces of Yanukovych, who ordered his forces to open fire on people there. But there were a lot of just teenagers and guys in their early 20s who said that they would then sign up after that, and they were all going to go to the front and face down Russia. And I assume they did. And what has happened to them?
So I also stood in the Orange Revolution, and the Revolution of Dignity. Over the 93 days of it, I was on Maidan for 89 out of those 93 days, not round the clock, but I mean, I saw all of the things that you're describing. And
can I just ask you, do you ever hold revolutions there when it's warm?
I thought the same thing myself, actually, that we should attempt to do that.
I don't mean to make light of something very serious, but I mean, it was free. The Orange Revolution was minus 35 degrees, and I think Maidan was also pretty cold.
Yeah, the coldest period on Maidan, it was minus 27, minus 28 in the week of fighting after the passage of the dictatorship laws. So Yanukovych's Parliament on the 16th of December passed this slew of laws basically outlawing any kind of protest activity. And the next Sunday, so every Sunday was a big meeting with many, many tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. The next Sunday, people went around the corner to where there was a roadblock on the street leading to the government quarter, to the Cabinet of Ministers and the Parliament building, and it really kicked off there. But that week of fighting was terribly cold. It was bitter. It was nasty. But
yeah. I mean, you're correct. A lot of the same thing has happened in Belarus, by the way. But Lukashenko has been successful in putting down people and stopping those big demonstrations. And Ukrainians were relentless in fighting and standing there on that square no matter what. And there were a lot of losses. So what happened to all those young men that went to the front? And are they still there today? Was it a momentary fever that passed, and these are now regular, more seasoned troops on the front lines holding the line?
So one of the things that we look at as an indicator for potential PTSD and other kinds of psychological trauma is how long a person has actually served at the front for. It's when we get calls to Lifeline Ukraine, it's among our first set of questions. How long were you serving? So there would be very few people who have spent the whole 7 years on the front line. I recently met a Marine who had spent 5 years on the front line, and that's pretty extreme length of service.
Hell of a long time to be in a war zone. Yeah,
exactly. But yeah, many of the people who were on the Maidan, young and old, not just the younger people, but many of them did. They stood on Maidan because they were patriots, and they wanted the better for their country, and they went to defend their country as well. Yeah. So
Paul, is there kind of a generation of shell-shocked Ukrainians who have been fighting this war, or somebody had been touched by somebody in their family or their neighbors for 7 years now, and it just keeps going?
We all know somebody who has lost their life out in the East. There is this generation that you mentioned, but it's really a generation of war hardened people rather than shell shocked. We've become, and I mean, one of the things that I participate in, my contribution is I try to participate in the information war side of things, which is why I was happy for the invitation to join you on your podcast today. I like to help people understand the situation in Ukraine and correct myths, and that's That's really why I became a writer about Ukrainian affairs, because someone needed to be explaining this. And hundreds and hundreds of articles later in the Atlantic Council and the Kiev Post and so on and so on. But I'm known for that. But I'm not tired of it. I am weary of it, though. It's a constant need to push back, especially now as well, because to launch new military activities against Ukraine, Russia needs to create some kind of justification. So, again, we're having to push back at these false narratives and lies. There was a
Look,
story.
It's very serious, because that propaganda always paves the road before they take real action. And, you can draw lots of parallels with Georgia, for example, where they said that Georgia was becoming more aggressive. Georgia was, pushing into different areas and attacking. And there were some instances of that. But certainly what's playing out in the Russia press, I'm an expert on watching Russia, and I was based there for 12 years. I can tell you that when you see the escalation in programmed channels, in mainstream TV networks that are now carrying messages that, Ukraine is moving forces, Ukraine looks like it's getting set to attack, Ukraine is presenting a problem to the so-called rebels in the East. It seems that they are paving the road for military intervention.
That's exactly what they do, precisely, Dana. Yeah, they have to ramp up the rhetoric first of all to justify what their actions that are coming down the line.
So people feel it's going to happen.
Yes, sadly, yeah. There can be many. I've seen a lot of people trying to guess at what Putin's kind of motivation is. He has Duma elections coming up later on in the year, so might this kind of motivate people to be behind him because he's making a stand for the Russians of the Donbass, which is another figment of their imagination, another invention that's coming from them right now. So some people are looking at that. I'll go back to what I was saying, though. As the one of the justifications for the seizure of Crimea and then later on the war in Donbass is that domestically, Putin cannot allow for there to be a perception in the Russian population of a successful outcome of a revolution. And the same is true in Belarus today, which is why he's involved himself there now, temporarily propping up Lukashenko, but also looking at what the potential other avenues are for the future of a Russian-controlled Belarus. Putin's biggest fear is a Maidan-style revolution. And it's something I feel personally quite proud of, that the word Maidan is now synonymous with revolution throughout the post-Soviet space. We did that, we created that, very pleased. But it terrifies him, and justifiably so as well, because he is the most corrupt person surrounded by this cabal of thieves. And rightly, the Russian people should remove him and, stop him from looting billions and billions of dollars out of their country every single year. We see it every time there's a protest that's planned, like the forces they put out on the streets. They're terrified of letting a Maidan-style movement take hold, and I think that's Putin's biggest motivator at the moment is to try to do something to avoid domestic unrest, because we saw it last year, especially in Khabarovsk, where they were relentless until the winter bit, and then the other nationwide protests that were organized by Navalny, who's obviously now being mistreated in prison, where he shouldn't be. He was in prison for breaking the terms of parole.
Well, Paul, Ukraine would be a tragic distraction from his domestic problems, and let's hope that while it's a tinderbox, that he's trying to rattle the West and he doesn't go any further. But thank you so much for your time.
It's been my pleasure talking to you. Thank you, Dana.
And that's this backstory on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. We'll keep watching this standoff and bring you updates on our newsletter, danalewis.substack.com. Please subscribe to the newsletter and share this podcast. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.